Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but he was short and he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." And so he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost."
This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Have you ever had to fall in love over again? Have you ever wanted to fall in love over again? I have. I have been married for more than 30 years, and there are times when my husband and I look at each other and we say, let's go back to that day when we looked at each other and our smiles were broad and our eyes twinkled and we only had eyes for each other. Do you remember that? For you youth, you might still be waiting for that moment when you meet that perfect girl or that perfect guy and the world just centers around them. And you could say to someone, "Oh, I just love them." I remember in 2nd grade, I came home and my eyes were twinkling. And I was the youngest of 5, and so my sisters always knew what was going on in my life. I had no secrets. And so I came home, and pretty soon my mom came to me and she said, "So what's going on?" And I said, "Nothing." And I held my hand like this. I said, "Nothing." And she said, "What's on your finger?" And I just knew that my older sister had tattled. And I said, "There's nothing on my finger." And she said, "Let me see." And I held it out, and I had this bubble gum ring on my finger because someone in 2nd grade named Greg came up to the playground and he said, "Do you want to go with me?" And I said, "Sure." And I was in love. And my mom burst that bubble because she said, "You take that ring and you give it right back to him. You give it right back to him tomorrow, and you tell him that you can't go with him." I don't think it's called going with somebody anymore. I'm learning. I spend so much time with youth. They teach me words. Some words I don't want to know. They teach me. And so I said to my mom that yes, I would, because I was terrified to disobey. I really was a good kid. And so I said that I would give the ring back. But under my breath, I said, "But you can't make me not love him. I'm going to love him. And I'm going to love him for the rest of my life." Well, Kevin taught me otherwise. Greg was not going to be the love of my life for the rest of my life. Kevin was going to be the love of my life for the rest of my life. But falling in love over again is not easy work. It's intentional, right? I mean, do all of you wake up in the morning and say, "Oh, I just love you"? Be honest. We don't. There are some days when it feels a little bit more like love than other days, but most morning it really is a decision to get up and say, "This is the person that I'm in relationship with. This is my mother or my father or my husband or my wife or my son or my daughter, and so I am choosing today to love them, to love them." And sometimes we allow ourselves that childlike faith, that childlike love, to really enjoy what love is supposed to be. But most of the time, unfortunately, most of the time we try to be very grown up. We try to stay very busy. We try to work on our careers and do everything that we're supposed to do at the expense of a childlike quality of love and joy. There was a professor that was teaching at a college, and his name was Dr. Ruskin. And he was talking about these stages of aging, that we start out as a child, and then we grow up, and we're very mature-like, at least most of us are very mature-like, and then we get to a certain age, and then we start to forget things. Is anyone there? You probably forgot. And so we get to that age, and then pretty soon, dementia starts, and then you know that when you go to the refrigerator, and you're going to look for something, but you find your socks in the refrigerator, and you wonder, how did they get there? And believe it or not, we start out in diapers being cared for, and we end up, I'm sorry, but in diapers and being cared for. And I just find it ironic that it's this full cycle. It's this full cycle. And so he was studying these aging processes, and so he gave his class a case study, and he said, I need to tell you this case study, and then I'm going to ask you a question at the end of it. And this is what he says. This patient neither speaks nor comprehends a spoken word. Sometimes this patient, she babbles incoherently for hours on end. She's disoriented about person, place, and time. But she does, however, she responds to her name. I've worked with her for the past 6 months, and she still shows complete disregard for her physical appearance. She makes no effort to assist in her own care. She has to be bathed and fed and clothed by others. Because she has no teeth, her food has to be pureed. Her shirt is usually soiled from almost incessant drooling. She does not walk. Her sleep pattern is erratic. She often wakes in the middle of the night, and her screaming awakens others. And most of the time she's friendly, but several times a day she just gets agitated for no apparent reason. And then she has to have someone come in to comfort her. Now, after presenting the class with this challenging case, Dr. Ruskin asked his students if any of them would be willing to volunteer to work with this person. No one volunteered. Then Dr. Ruskin said, I'm surprised that none of you offered to help, because actually, she is my very favorite patient. My very favorite. I get immense pleasure from taking care of her. And he said, I'm learning so much from her. She has taught me a depth of gratitude I never knew before. She's taught me the spirit of unwavering trust, and she's taught me the power of unconditional love. And Dr. Ruskin said, let me show you her picture. And he pulled out the picture, and he passed it around. And it was a photo of his 6-month-old daughter. Yeah, not what you were expecting. You see, there's a childlike faith that is required from each one of us. And it's that very childlike faith that we struggle with sometimes the most. It's in the story of Zacchaeus that I just revel in the fact that Zacchaeus gives us that childlike faith. For instance, he is this tax collector despised by the Jews because he aligned himself with the Roman government, and he was collecting these taxes, and tax collectors were allowed to add on an additional tax that went into their pockets. And so not only were they despised, but they were seen as crooks. They were seen as people that take more than what they need to take. And so Zacchaeus somehow gets word about Jesus, and it piques his curiosity, as once upon a time it piqued your curiosity to learn about Jesus. But the first thing I see that's so childlike is Zacchaeus challenges the ways of discovery. He could have elbowed his way through the crowd. He could have used his power, and he could have gone to the front of the crowd, and he could have demanded an audience, but he didn't. What did he do? Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and he climbed up the sycamore tree. Our children love this song. They love this story. You know why? They can relate to it. It's childlike. He climbs a tree. Who climbs a tree? Have any of you climbed a tree lately? Yeah, we don't climb trees. We leave that for our little ones to do. But Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus. And he thought outside the box, and he said, how can I do this? And he was too short. And so he climbs up a tree. He's up a tree. My governing council, that group of 12 people that hold me accountable to the mission and the vision of the church, they make sure that I'm doing everything I can to make disciples. They have this analogy that Paul Borden gave them, and they remind me all the time. They'll say, Pastor Jan, are you up the tree? Because Paul Borden gave them, when he came to Matthew 28, gave them this analogy that the pastor has to be up the tree. Because when you get up the tree, you can see more. And so the pastor has to see the mission and the vision, and the pastor has to have that perspective that's a little wider than if you're walking around at the bottom of the tree. And so many times when they see me and I'm doing something that's kind of in ministry, and I'm really kind of like, I'm enjoying it, but I'm down here on this level, they'll say, back up the tree. You're supposed to lead us. You're not supposed to be doing ministry. You're supposed to be leading us to do ministry. And so I feel like a squirrel, and I get right back up the tree again, and then when they're not looking, I come down and I enjoy a little bit of ministry, and then I go right back up again. But they hold me accountable to that because it's important. Because I get to see more. I get to hear from God more when I'm up the tree. And I think that's what Zacchaeus got. Zacchaeus heard and saw. And Jesus comes right under that tree, and then Jesus has that moment with Zacchaeus. Just like Jesus has that moment with you. That Zacchaeus looks at Jesus, and Jesus looks at Zacchaeus, and he says, Zacchaeus, I see you. I see you. I love you. I accept you, Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus scrambles down that tree, and right then and there, Zacchaeus changes direction. Did you see that? It's not just a period of time. It's immediate. And Zacchaeus says, Jesus, if I've extorted it from anyone, I'm going to pay him back 4 times. That's huge. That's more than the law required. And then he says, and you know what? I am so grateful that you're noticing me. I'm so grateful that I have something new in my life, and it's called Jesus, and I'm free. And I'm going to give half of my possessions to the poor. We're only asked to give a tenth. That's 10%. And Zacchaeus is going, you know what? I'm going to give 50%. Sacrificially, because I have a new name. I've been claimed, I've been known, and I've been made known. My life has changed directions. And finally, Zacchaeus gets a new name. Because Jesus says, and don't miss that in the scripture, Jesus says, Zacchaeus, you are the son of Abraham. See, he wasn't considered the son of Abraham before because he was a tax collector, and they were kind of pushed off to the side. They were shunned. And Jesus takes him from that dark place, and he says, no, you're a son of light. And you are the son of Abraham now. You are just as good as anyone else, Zacchaeus. You are no more and no less than my child. And so, Pat McGrath tells a modern version of Zacchaeus. This is it. When Mr. Sanders turned the corner onto 15th Street, he heard the music. Although he scarcely considered the banging of upturned empty plastic paint drums and metal garbage cans and hollow construction pipes to be music. A crowd was gathered around the street performer. People tapped their feet and swayed to the drumming. Some came forward and tossed money into a cardboard box. Mr. Sanders turned up his collar on his cashmere coat against the wind and noise, and he crossed the street. As he turned the corner onto Prior Street, though, he paused up to look at the gleaming skyscraper that loomed over the block. Corners of his mouth turned into a smile. He loved to turn this corner and to see her because it was his building. 30 floors of steel and glass reflecting the surrounding city and his own success. Focused on getting upstairs to the board meeting, Mr. Sanders stumbled out over the outstretched foot of an old man sitting on the sidewalk. An angry hiss escaped his lips as he turned into the unshaven face of the homeless man. Mr. Sanders braced himself, expecting the old man to hold out an empty tin to beg for some spare change. But instead, the old man's yellow eyes smiled and he opened his mouth into a grin. There, stuck between stained teeth, was a white stick, and on it was a red lollipop. The old man held out his hand and he offered Mr. Sanders a cellophane-wrapped red lollipop. And Mr. Sanders felt himself taking that lollipop against his own logic and looking more closely into this old man's face. The old man nodded his head as though in answer, and he tilted his head back and closed his eyes against the brick building that he was leaning on. Mr. Sanders just stood there. Then he slowly turned and started back towards his building. As he walked, he looked down at the lollipop. He hadn't seen a red lollipop in years. He was surprised that it even still, they had always been making them. He tore the clear wrapping off and he stuck the cherry candy into his mouth. Memories of clear jars holding penny candy on long, dark wood shelves flooded his mind. The lollipop colored his tongue bright red as he rolled it around in his mouth, as he had done some 40 years before. He pulled the lollipop out and held it up to the light, and the world took on a red glow. Popped it back in his mouth, and he smiled, perhaps for the first time in a long time. 30 minutes later, Mr. Sanders pushed through the heavy doors in the conference room. The 8 waiting executives sat up and flipped open the folders spread on the long table. "Sorry to be late," Mr. Sanders said. "Let's get started." The man on Mr. Sanders' right cleared his throat and began, "We're progressing on schedule. The last of the residents will be moved out, and the whole 12 blocks between Linwood and Allen will be empty by the end of the year. Our contract on the zoning board, he tells us, we'll have no problems." Mr. Sanders interrupted. "Did you know that there's a lake in the woods behind the old grocery store on Allen?" Surprised, the young man looked up from his notes and hesitated. "Yes, sir, that's Bear Lake. That will be drained and the spring will be diverted for use as irrigation or landscaping around the complex." The young man searched his notes and ready to continue again, but Mr. Sanders interrupted and said, "My father and I used to fish on that lake. Did you know that, Jason?" "No, I didn't know it," Jason replied. "My mother would take the fish that we caught and she'd dredge them in cornmeal and egg and fry them up for us." "Jason, do you fish?" "No," Jason replied. He said, "My father golfs." "Well," he said, "Jason, you should take your boy fishing. You have a son, don't you?" "Yes, sir. He's 8. Mr. Saunders stood up and walked over the large-scale model of what he had created. To his pride and his joy, he stood, hands in his pockets, staring at it. Then he said, "I decided I'm going to make a few changes." "What change? What change?" "Don't get upset, Jason. It's bad for your digestion. But I decided we're going to relocate that factory complex. Harrison, tomorrow you and Wilson get a hold of our realtors. Find us another piece of property." All the executives were stunned. They had never seen Mr. Sanders act so, well, irrational and childlike. Slowly, Mr. Sanders looked around the table into the faces of his employees. When he got to Jason, he said, "Jason, take the rest of the day off and take that boy fishing." Out on the street, Mr. Sanders stopped in front of that sleeping, homeless man. He unfolded a new quilt, and he sat down beside him. And together they unwrapped, yes, red lollipops. They stuck them in their mouths, and they remembered what it was like to have joy and to be childlike. You and I, friends, are on a terrible merry-go-round of business. You work hard in your jobs. You work hard in your homes. You work hard in all that you do. But the challenge this morning is, have you lost your childlike faith? Have you forgotten that every day is a chance to fall in love over again with God? Are you taking the time necessary to just be quiet and still? God is God. Are you listening to good music by God, loved by God, cleansed by God, that we might turn to a busy world and say, stop, stop, let's fall in love. God, we're amazed by your love. And we confess that doesn't get all our attention. That instead, we stay busy, we stay distracted, we stay on time to sit with the lover of our souls. And yet, if we don't sit with you, O God, we will not experience your love. So hold us to this word. Help us daily to find quiet time, to sit and to rest, to be still and to know that you are our loving Father, Abba. And help us to greet the world with love and peace.